Hi guys, today we're gonna be talking about this section of the notes where we're talking about variation in our natural selection. So before I get into that, we have noticed or we worked with the steps of natural selection, right? I have to have variation. One of those variants has an advantage, causing them to survive. Because they survive, they're going to be reproducing. More of that will be in the population, and eventually the frequency of that variant will be high. So today we're going to talk about a few different methods of how we get this variation. Okay, how do individuals differ within a species? There's four methods that we're going to talk about. One is mutations. These are mutations in chromosomes, mutations in DNA, random mating, gene flow, and genetic drift. Okay, so these are four methods of how a species can generate variation within the population. So let's talk about each of these. Mutations. We've talked about mutations before, right? When we were in genetics and DNA in our chromosomes, it's just a change that occurs in our DNA. So because we have billions of those nucleotides, most of those mutations don't cause any serious effects. However, if there is a mutation that really changes the organism, such as in a negative way, um, the natural selection will prevent that negative mutation from going into future generations. So let's look at this example here. We have a bunch of little beetles. Notice their genotypes are all little a, right? In their gametes, their egg and sperm production, there happens to be a mutation. And remember that mutations forming in a gamete can get passed on, right? A mutation formed in a skin cell is not going to necessarily get passed on to the next generation. But if it happens in a sperm or egg cell, it will. So my mutation here is that one of these little a's was randomly mutated into a big A, right? So this is in a gamete, so it will get passed on to the generation. And notice I see that effect of this mutation here. I have a new genotype causing it to have a new phenotype, right? What it looks like. So this one is black and the others are white. Now, if this was a good mutation, right, natural selection would help this individual survive more than these. But if this was a bad mutation, and let's say it didn't blend in as much, or it had trouble finding shelter because of this new phenotype, natural selection would cause the mutated gene to pass on and die while allowing the other ones to survive. Okay, so mutations do occur and they do create this variation, allowing the chance for natural selection to happen. 2. Random mating. So this one is pretty simple, right? A choice of a partner is not influenced by the individual's genes. And remember, genes affect what you look like, so it's just completely up to chance of what individual will mate with another. So this picture here is a picture of coral. They disperse their sperm and egg into the ocean currents, and just randomly, one individual's sperm will match up with another individual's egg, and it's completely random. So because of this, this creates variation. However, what we're used to and what we see is not really random, so I wanted to talk about some non-random mating examples. One is sexual selection, and this is where one sex has a preference or one sex has an advantage that influences the mating here. So an example are deer, right? Female deer are going to choose their mate based on of this trait of their antlers, right? Because they use it for territory and fighting. So the antlers of a deer affect how it's going to mate. It's not random. A deer with larger antlers will have an easier time mating than a deer with a small antlers. Or peacocks. Peacocks are going to be influenced by their feathers, right? So this is sexual selection. One sex has a preference or advantage that influences the mating. Another way that mating cannot be random is through artificial selection. We kind of already talked about this one, right? We talked about the dog example where humans are manipulating their traits. It is definitely not random. Humans are controlling what goes with what, so it's decreasing variation, right? Imagine if there was no um, human selection for dogs and everything was just random, we wouldn't have these clear, distinct breeds. Another example is wild mustard. If scientists are manipulating wild mustard and pairing it with certain things, we get these different vegetables. So this is an example of how humans are controlling the mating patterns, causing it not to be random. Okay. Next, gene flow. This one's a pretty simple one as well. So gene flow. Just think of the name, gene flow. I have genes flowing into and out of a population. And these words should be familiar to you guys as well. I have immigration, which is an individual going into a new population, and I have emigration, which is an individual leaving a population, right? Pretty self-explanatory. This obviously will create variation. If this white bird with little a, immigrates to this population, to population 2, this population 2 will now have a variety, right? And natural selection can take place. People often confuse this one, though, with genetic drift. So let's explain the difference here. This is when I change my genes, but it's completely random. The individual's genes have no effect on whether they survive or not, and this usually happens by things out of the organism's control, like natural events such as earthquakes or volcanoes, natural disasters, new competitors coming in, new diseases coming into the population. So imagine this new competitor entered the population and it was just eating random individuals, right? That individual that got eaten had no control over that. Their genes did not help or hurt them in that way. An important thing to note is that this usually occurs in small populations. So imagine I have this small population and a boulder fell on most of them, okay, allowing just a couple individuals to survive. That would affect that small population a lot more than if that boulder were to fall on this much larger population, right? Imagine if that population was really big, that boulder falling on them wouldn't affect them as much, allowing them to still have their variation, if that makes sense. So there's these two effects that are great examples of what genetic drift can be. The first one is a bottleneck effect. So this is coming from the name of a bottle. The neck of a bottle is kind of a narrowing feature that leads into something else. So I have my original population here. Notice it's pretty even in distribution. I have even red and blue. An event happens and it's not all pouring out, right? Because of this bottleneck effect, only a few can come out at a time. So, what's my new population like after this event happened? I just happen to have more red than I do blue, right? So if this is my new population, they're going to survive, they're going to reproduce, and my next generation, notice my distribution here. It's mostly red and a few blue individuals, very different from my original. Another effect is the founder effect. This is when few individuals from a population start a new population, allowing a different frequency of alleles. So look at this population up here. I have white, black, and orange butterflies, right? This just happened to be that a couple orange and black butterflies have gone to this little island. Now, if they stay here, they're going to create their own population, and it's going to be different. Why? Because there's no white butterflies over here, right? So this population has more variety than this population will. Same thing with this example. On this part, I have red and yellow bugs, and if I just happen to have a couple red bugs go over, it now has a different set of variation. So these are things that are changing the gene pool that are not influenced by their genes, they're just random events. This is an error test question. What I need you to know for this is that the larger population equals more variety in genes, right? And these different graphs show an allele frequency. So how much are these different alleles present, okay? And I have different population sizes, 30, 300, 3,000. So look at these graphs really quickly. Which graph do you think has more variety? If I was to look at this, I would say this one would, right? I have different variety for all of these different genes. So my biggest population of 3,000 would go there. Next, I would say this one has the next largest variety, causing my 300 individuals to go here. And this one not showing much variety at all. It's pretty much the same as the generations go on. So my 30 individual, my smallest population, would go here. So, big idea. Species need variation to evolve. If they don't, they won't be able to adapt and survive when the environment changes. We just discussed 4 methods of how species can develop their variation.